The sea was restless that summer of 1549. On the horizon, sails cut across the waves like pale wings, carrying with them the smell of foreign spices and the murmur of strange prayers. On the shore of Kagoshima, fishermen squinted against the blazing sun, their hearts torn between curiosity and fear. Few could have known that within the timbers of that ship lay a seed that would ignite both hope and tragedy across the islands of Japan. Can a new faith, carried on the wind from distant lands, truly take root in soil already nourished by centuries of gods and ancestors? Or does destiny demand a price for every fire it permits to burn? The man who stepped onto Japan's shore was Francis Xavier, a Jesuit missionary from faraway Spain. He carried neither sword nor banner, only a crucifix held close to his breast and words that he believed could heal souls. His black robe billowed in the sea breeze, as if a shadow had been torn from the horizon and given form. For the people of Kagoshima, this stranger was unlike any they had seen. His eyes glimmered with conviction, his speech strange yet burning with passion. Alongside him came interpreters, merchants, and whispers of trade. In the tense silence of that moment, Japan stood at a threshold, between its ancient traditions and the storm of foreign belief that threatened to engulf them. At first, Christianity seemed little more than another curiosity from the West. Merchants had already brought guns and clocks, glass and wine. To many daimyo lords who ruled their domains with both cunning and steel, the Jesuits were useful. Their presence promised access to the lucrative Portuguese trade routes, and with them the muskets that could tip the balance of war. But the message Xavier carried was not one of war. It was of salvation, of a single God who demanded no shrine of wood or stone, no ancestral lineage, but only faith in his Son. For Japanese ears accustomed to the interwoven rituals of Buddhism and Shinto, these words were at once baffling and intoxicating. The foreign priest spoke of eternal life, of forgiveness, of a kingdom beyond death. Some listened in wonder, others turned away in suspicion. Yet already the spark had caught. Among Xavier's first converts were not only fishermen and farmers, but also men of learning. Samurai, priests, and scholars came to test his words. He debated Buddhist monks in temples, sometimes with fiery clashes, other times with respectful curiosity. His Japanese was broken, his knowledge imperfect, yet his conviction was undeniable. And conviction, like fire, has a way of spreading where tinder is dry. Xavier saw in Japan a fertile ground for the gospel. He marveled at the discipline of its people, their thirst for knowledge, their capacity for loyalty. Unlike in other lands, he believed, here Christianity might truly flourish, if only it could survive the storms of politics. But storms were already gathering. The daimyo who welcomed Xavier were pragmatic men. Some saw baptism not as salvation, but as strategy, a way to bind themselves to foreign allies and acquire weapons of war. In the candle-lit halls of their castles, crosses and muskets lay side by side, symbols of both faith and power. Was it truly belief that was spreading, or was it ambition clothed in sacred words? By the time Xavier departed Japan in 1551, Christianity had already taken fragile root. Churches had been built, converts numbered in the thousands, and Nagasaki was beginning to stir with a new identity. Yet, Xavier himself would never see the full harvest of what he planted. He died just 1 year later on the island of Shangchuan, gazing longingly toward China, never to set foot in Japan again. Still, the embers he left behind glowed brightly. His successors carried the mission forward, weaving themselves into the tapestry of Japanese life. Jesuits learned the language, adopted customs, and even dressed like Buddhist monks to better blend in. They baptized peasants and daimyo alike, offering not only the promise of heaven but also the practical allure of foreign trade. Nagasaki, once a quiet port, became the beating heart of Japan's Christian world. Bells tolled over the harbor. Children sang hymns in a language their ancestors had never heard, and farmers crossed themselves before the harvest. It was a strange new dawn, both fragile and radiant. And yet, every dawn carries within it the shadow of night. Beneath the surface, questions began to fester. Could a man serve both his Lord and a distant pope in Rome? Could loyalty be divided between the shogun and a foreign god? And if this faith grew too strong, would it not threaten the fragile unity of the land? As the first generation of Japanese Christians bowed before their wooden crucifixes, the air was already thick with uncertainty. What had begun as a whisper on the horizon now burned like a flame, and flames, once lit, are not so easily contained. Xavier had once written, "I would not exchange even one of their souls for all the riches of the East." His words burned with love, yet to the rulers of Japan, those same souls would soon seem less like treasures and more like threats. For now, however, the faith spread. Baptisms multiplied, churches flourished, and the name of Christ was carried across valleys and mountains. It was an age of possibility, when the future seemed open, and the fire of belief warmed the hearts of many. But just beyond the horizon, silence and blood awaited. And so, the story begins with fire on the horizon, with hope and ambition entwined, with questions that neither Xavier nor the daimyo could yet answer. What does it mean for a people to embrace a new faith? Can truth survive when it is entangled with power? And is belief a gift of freedom or the seed of suffering yet to come? The seed of faith once planted does not grow in silence alone. It takes root in soil both fertile and hostile, reaching for the light even as shadows threaten to choke it. In Japan of the mid-16th century, that soil was a land torn by ambition and war. Warlords fought like storm winds across the islands, daimyo grasping for power in the chaos of the Sengoku era. It was into this soil that the Jesuits scattered their first seeds, not knowing which would bear fruit and which would be scorched by fate. The peasants who first heard of Christ found comfort in his words. They were weary of endless battles between lords, of villages burned, of harvests seized to feed armies. A God who promised mercy, who cherished even the lowliest soul, was a vision more precious than rice. They gathered in secret corners of fields and homes, listening to the missionaries whisper of paradise and forgiveness. For men and women who lived beneath the crushing weight of hierarchy, this was not simply religion, it was liberation. Yet faith alone does not decide the course of history. Above the peasants stood the daimyo, whose choices shaped the land as surely as the sun and rain shaped the fields. And the daimyo, practical men of war, saw in Christianity more than spiritual comfort. They saw opportunity. The Portuguese traders who sailed into Japanese harbors brought with them more than missionaries. They carried guns, matchlocks, muskets, cannons, the very tools that could turn the tide of war. The daimyo knew well that whoever controlled the trade with the Portuguese controlled not only wealth but survival, and the Jesuits, by strange coincidence or divine providence, were the gatekeepers of that trade. Thus, conversions among the powerful were not always born from devotion. Some daimyo bent the knee before the cross to secure alliances, to guarantee access to European firepower. Baptism for them was less an act of faith than a contract signed in water. Among the most notable was Mura Sumitada, the first Japanese daimyo to openly convert to Christianity in 1563. His baptismal name was Bartolomeu, and with his new faith came a flood of Portuguese support. He granted Nagasaki to the Jesuits, transforming the harbor town into the greatest Christian stronghold in Japan. The bells of churches rang out across the bay, echoing off the hillsides where samurai once sharpened blades. Nagasaki became in many ways a city baptized not only in water, but in blood and commerce. And yet, even for Sumitada, the line between belief and strategy blurred. Did he embrace Christ out of devotion, or because Christ came with muskets and silver? Could the purity of faith survive when bound so tightly to the engines of war? The Jesuits themselves walked a delicate path. They dreamed of souls saved, of Japan rising as a beacon of Christ in the East. But they were not blind. They knew that their survival depended on the goodwill of men whose hearts were ruled as much by ambition as by piety. They clothed themselves in Japanese garments, learned the tongue, and bowed as custom demanded. They preached humility, yet wielded influence with quiet precision. In temples and castles, debates raged. Buddhist monks, scholars, and priests challenged the foreign doctrine. How could there be only one God when Japan's mountains, rivers, and ancestors were filled with countless spirits? How could a man from a distant land claim authority over the souls of their people? For every convert won, another turned away in suspicion or scorn. Still, the faith spread. Samurai found themselves intrigued by the discipline of the Jesuits, the order of their prayers, the courage of their martyrs. Farmers baptized their children in rivers at dawn, whispering foreign names beneath the rising mist. Merchants crossed themselves before setting sail, believing that the foreign god might guard their voyages as well as their profits. The seed had found soil, but the roots were twisted, half nourished by devotion, half by necessity. And yet, within this mixture of motives, true believers did emerge. Some daimyo embraced Christianity not as a tool, but as a calling. Dom Justo Takayama, a samurai who converted and later became a daimyo, refused to renounce his faith even when it cost him land and title. He chose exile over apostasy, becoming a symbol of faith, unshaken by politics. His story would echo through the centuries, a reminder that among the calculations of warlords, there were still those who heard the whisper of truth. But for every Takayama, there were 10 others who bent their faith to ambition. Crosses stood beside armories. Prayers mingled with trade agreements. Jesuit reports sent back to Europe glowed with optimism, recounting the thousands baptized, the churches rising, the lords kneeling before Christ. Yet beneath the triumphant words lay uneasy truths. Faith had become currency, and its purity was already shadowed by the weight of swords and silver. The Sengoku period was a time of blood and fire, and in such an age no seed could grow untouched. The gospel entered Japan not as a serene stream, but as a river forced through rocks, broken, reshaped, and made to flow along paths it had not intended. Still, the missionaries believed. They believed that even in compromise, even in ambition, the flame of Christ's love burned, that among the many who converted for gain, there would be those who found something deeper, something that endured beyond power. And indeed they were right. For in Nagasaki's streets and in the hearts of peasants who owned nothing but their prayers, true devotion stirred. The seed was fragile, perhaps deformed by the soil, but it lived, and in its living, it carried both promise and peril. Every seed carries within it the memory of what it might become. Yet not all seeds grow true to their nature. Some are twisted by the soil, others consumed by the weeds. And still, some push through, fragile yet unbroken. In Japan, the seed of Christianity was planted in soil both rich and treacherous. The question remained, would it bear fruit of faith or of ambition, clothed in holy words? In the age of the Sengoku Wars, few cities seemed destined for greatness. Nagasaki, once a quiet fishing village tucked against the hills of Kyushu, would have remained a modest harbor if not for the tides of faith and commerce that reshaped its shores. But when the cross rose above its rooftops, and the tolling of church bells mingled with the cries of fishermen, Nagasaki became more than a city. It became a crucible where faith, trade, and destiny fused in fire. It was Mura Sumitada's gift to the Jesuits that marked the beginning. By granting them control over the harbor, he did more than open a port. He opened a sanctuary. Churches sprang from the earth like blossoms in spring, their wooden beams stretching heavenward, their altars lit with flickering candles. Priests walked the streets in black robes, speaking Latin prayers that floated above the din of markets. The air itself seemed to shimmer with change. To the peasants and townsfolk, the harbor became a place of wonder. They saw Portuguese ships glide into the bay, their hulls heavy with goods from across the seas, silk from China, spices from India, silver and weapons from Europe. The city thrummed with life, its streets alive with traders, priests, peasants, and soldiers. Christianity, once a whisper carried by missionaries, now stood boldly in wood and stone. Nagasaki was no longer just a Japanese city, it was a city of God. Faith here was not confined to dimly lit rooms or whispered prayers. It was public, triumphant, alive. Hymns rang out on Sundays, voices raised not in secret, but in celebration. Processions wound through the streets, crosses lifted high, children clutching rosaries carved from seeds. Entire families knelt in prayer, their homes adorned with crucifixes and icons. To walk through Nagasaki in those years was to feel the pulse of a new world, where the old and new coexisted uneasily but vibrantly. Yet beneath the joy, questions lingered. Was Nagasaki holy ground, or a pawn in the great game of daimyo and traders? Could a city born of faith and commerce truly stand when the winds of suspicion began to rise? For the Jesuits, Nagasaki was a miracle. Here they found not only converts, but an entire community that lived and breathed the gospel. Seminaries trained Japanese priests, churches nurtured Japanese congregations, and schools taught children to read scripture. The vision of a Christian Japan no longer seemed distant. It was alive in Nagasaki's streets. Letters sent back to Europe glowed with triumph. Tens of thousands had been baptized, villages transformed, daimyo brought into the fold. Jesuit chroniclers described Nagasaki as the Rome of the East, a beacon of Christ's light in a land still shadowed by Buddhism and Shinto. To them, it was proof that the soil of Japan could indeed bear fruit, even if the roots were fragile. But Jesuit optimism was not blind. They knew the dangers of their success. For every church raised, suspicion grew in the hearts of those who watched from afar. Buddhist monks saw their temples emptied, their influence challenged. Shinto priests muttered that the foreign gods sought to erase Japan's ancient spirits. And to men like Toyotomi Hideyoshi, whose eyes surveyed the land with a ruler's suspicion, the sight of Nagasaki's crosses was less a miracle than a threat. Nagasaki's crucible was not forged in peace alone. It was hardened in the fires of conflict. Here, devotion and ambition were inseparable. Merchants thrived under Christian lords, but their prosperity was tied to foreign ships. Samurai bowed in churches, but many still carried their swords in the service of power, not faith. The people believed, yet around their faith swirled the smoke of politics and trade. Still, in the faces of the poor, the faith glowed purest. Peasants who once bowed to stone idols now lifted their hands to heaven, whispering prayers in broken Latin. Mothers taught their children the sign of the cross, believing it would protect them from sickness and war. Fishermen carved crosses into the wood of their boats, hoping that the God of the foreigners would guard them at sea. To them, the faith was not a strategy. It was a flame against the darkness of uncertainty. Yet fire attracts notice, and Nagasaki burned brightly. To Hideyoshi, the growing Christian presence seemed less like faith and more like a foreign foothold. If daimyo gave themselves to Rome, could they be trusted to give themselves to Japan? If merchants enriched the Jesuits, did their loyalty lie with Kyoto or with Lisbon? In 1587, the suspicion became decree. Hideyoshi ordered the expulsion of missionaries, citing fears that they undermined Japan's unity. The Jesuits scrambled, torn between obedience and defiance. Many left, others hid. Yet Nagasaki's flame did not die. Churches continued to rise, prayers continued to echo. The crucible had been tested, but the fire within endured. The people of Nagasaki did not yet know what fate awaited them. They could not imagine the blood that would one day soak Nishizaka Hill, nor the silence that would cloak their faith in centuries to come. For now, they lived in a fragile dawn, a moment when the future seemed radiant with possibility. They did not yet see the shadows gathering, nor hear the silence creeping closer. But history would not allow their peace to last. In every crucible, the fire must one day burn hotter. And in Nagasaki, the question was no longer whether the faith would endure, but how much blood it would require to survive. Faith, when tested in fire, reveals its truest form. Is it merely adornment, a cloak worn for gain, or is it the flame that refuses to be extinguished? Nagasaki burned brightly, but every flame carries its own shadow. What would remain when the fire met the sword? In every age, faith and power are drawn to one another like fire and wind. Each can fuel the other. Each can destroy the other. In 16th century Japan, Christianity did not spread in quiet solitude. It marched in step with armies, whispered in the halls of daimyo, and clanged against the iron of swords. The cross and the sword became inseparable, their union both salvation and doom. The Portuguese traders who arrived in Japan were not missionaries alone. They brought with them the lifeblood of war, guns. The arquebus, once a curiosity, became a weapon that reshaped the Sengoku battlefield. A daimyo with muskets could shatter the old order of samurai combat, cutting down armored warriors with thunder and smoke. To the warlords, the Jesuits, and the traders seemed two sides of one coin, faith and firepower. To embrace one was to invite the other. Thus, many conversions were inked not in belief, but in blood and strategy. Daimyo who opened their ports to the Jesuits gained not only priests but canons. To kneel before the cross was, at times, to rise with a stronger army. And yet, this mingling of faith and power would plant seeds of suspicion that would one day choke the faith itself. Tomo Sorin, the powerful daimyo of Bungo, became one of the most prominent Christian lords. Baptized as Francisco, he welcomed the Jesuits into his court, filling his domain with churches and Christian schools. Under his patronage, thousands of peasants and samurai were baptized, but the soldiers who fought under his banner often carried the cross, stitched upon their flags, a symbol as much of power as of prayer. In Nagasaki, merchants prospered under the Christian daimyo, their ships laden with silk and silver. Samurai swore fealty not only to their lord, but also to the strange new god their master had embraced. In the villages, farmers tilled the land under the watchful eyes of both crucifixes and soldiers. Faith and power became threads in the same tapestry, so tightly woven that none could say where one ended and the other began. But this union carried danger, for in Japan loyalty to one's lord was sacred, a bond sealed in blood. What then of loyalty to a distant pope in Rome? Could a samurai serve both his daimyo and a foreign god? Could a daimyo rule his land while bowing to an unseen spiritual king? Toyotomi Hideyoshi, rising to power in the late 16th century, saw these contradictions with piercing clarity. He was a man who sought unity above all, determined to forge order out of chaos. And to him, the sight of Christian daimyo, wielding both crosses and muskets, was not reassuring, it was alarming. Hideyoshi recognized the Jesuits' skill in diplomacy and education, their usefulness in trade, their influence over the lords of Kyushu. But he also saw their growing power, their loyalty to Rome, their ability to sway peasants and samurai alike. To a ruler who demanded absolute authority, this foreign faith was a shadow too dark to ignore. In 1587, after his conquest of Kyushu, Hideyoshi issued his edict expelling the missionaries. He accused them of undermining Japan's traditions, of enslaving converts to foreign masters, of plotting to divide the land. The order struck like thunder across Nagasaki. Priests fled, churches trembled, believers wept. And yet, Hideyoshi's decree was half-measured. For all his suspicion, he did not wish to lose the wealth of Portuguese trade. He expelled missionaries, yet allowed merchants to remain. He threatened the cross, yet still grasped the sword it offered. His ambivalence mirrored Japan itself, torn between fascination with the West and fear of its shadows. For the faithful, these years were both triumphant and perilous. In the villages, peasants still gathered for mass, though sometimes under the eyes of suspicious officials. In the castles of Christian daimyo, chapels stood beside armories. Children were baptized in rivers at dawn, their parents praying that neither their lord nor the shogun would forbid their faith. The gospel was preached, but every word carried the taste of danger. The Jesuits, too, felt the tension. Their mission had flourished beyond their dreams, but they knew their triumph was fragile. They wrote letters to Europe filled with both hope and dread. Hope that Japan might yet become the crown jewel of Christ's mission in Asia, dread that politics might soon strangle the faith. They prayed for patience, but history was not kind to patience. In time, the contradictions became unbearable. The sword could not remain sheathed, and the cross could not remain unchallenged. The same flames that had lit Nagasaki's dawn would one day consume its churches in fire. The daimyo, who once embraced baptism for power, would face the terrible choice between faith and survival, and the peasants who prayed in fields and forests would discover that belief could cost not only their homes but their lives. For now, however, the cross and the sword still marched together, in banners on the battlefield, in ships on the harbor, in prayers whispered by samurai before battle. Faith and power were bound. The crucible of Nagasaki burned brightly, but the steel within it was hardening for trials yet to come. When faith and power intertwine, can either remain pure? The cross may sanctify the sword, but the sword also stains the cross with blood. In the union of Christ and the warlords, Japan found both promise and peril, and as every crucible teaches, what is forged in fire must one day be tested in flame. The year was 1587, and the scent of incense still lingered in Nagasaki's churches when Toyotomi Hideyoshi's decree fell like a sudden storm. One moment, the bells rang freely across the harbor. The next, whispers of fear crept into the alleys. Priests who had once walked boldly in their black robes now travelled in secrecy, their crucifixes hidden beneath folds of cloth. The shadows had arrived. Hideyoshi was no fool. He had clawed his way from peasant origins to become the most powerful man in Japan. He knew that unity was fragile, that one spark could undo years of conquest. And in the Christian faith, he saw not merely a religion, but a movement that could fracture the land. A daimyo who bowed to Rome might one day resist Kyoto. A peasant who gave his soul to Christ might one day refuse to bow before his Lord. What was faith, if not the seed of rebellion? Thus his suspicion grew. He accused the missionaries of destroying Buddhist temples, of desecrating the spirits of Japan, of enslaving converts under the name of Christ. Whether these accusations were truth, rumor, or the poison of politics mattered little. In Hideyoshi's eyes, the danger was real. The edict to expel the missionaries was written in bold strokes, but in practice it was an ambivalent thing. Hideyoshi still craved the wealth of Portuguese trade, still welcomed their muskets and silver. He ordered the Jesuits out, yet allowed merchants to remain. He forbade the spread of Christianity, yet did not enforce his decree with absolute violence. It was a shadowed law, half threat, half warning. For the missionaries it was a cruel dilemma. Some departed, carrying their sorrow across the seas. Others remained in defiance, cloaking themselves in secrecy, trusting that the flame of Christ could survive even in darkness. They disguised themselves as merchants, wandered disguised as Buddhist monks, whispered masses in the dead of night. The cross, once lifted high in public squares, was now etched small on hidden wooden tokens, tucked inside sleeves and sandals. And yet, for all the fear, the faith did not wither. In some places it grew even stronger. For the peasants, the sight of their priests in danger made their devotion burn more fiercely. To risk one's life for belief gave that belief a gravity that comfort and safety never could. The very suspicion that Hideyoshi cast became fuel for the fire. But suspicion breeds cruelty, and cruelty hung heavy in the air. Reports circulated of converts forced to abandon their faith, of Buddhist temples pressing their advantage, of daimyo caught between loyalty to Christ and loyalty to Hideyoshi. In villages, neighbors began to watch each other more closely. A whispered prayer, a hidden crucifix, a child crossing himself before eating any of these could draw the wrong attention. In Kyoto, Hideyoshi summoned missionaries to question them. He demanded to know why they had come, what they sought, and who gave them authority. The priests answered with courage, but courage did not ease his mistrust. Though he allowed some to remain, their days of freedom were gone. Every step they took was shadowed by suspicion. And still, Hideyoshi hesitated. He did not yet unleash the sword upon the Christians. Perhaps he feared the wrath of Portugal. Perhaps he doubted the loyalty of Christian daimyo. Perhaps he still weighed the silver against the faith. But his suspicion was like a dark cloud over the land, and all who lived under the cross felt its weight. In Nagasaki, life continued, but with a tremor. Churches still rang their bells, yet parishioners glanced over their shoulders as they entered. Farmers still prayed, yet whispered their words in fields where no one could hear. Mothers still baptized their children, yet did so at night, beneath the cover of silence. The city remained vibrant, but its joy was now tinged with fear. The Jesuits wrote back to Europe with cautious words. They spoke of conversions and baptisms, but also of shadows lengthening, They knew that faith born in fire would be tested, and they braced themselves for trials they could not yet imagine. For Hideyoshi's suspicion was not the end. It was only the beginning. In 1597, 10 years after his first decree, the shadows grew teeth. On a cold February day, 26 Christians, priests, and believers alike were led to Nishizaka Hill in Nagasaki. There, before the eyes of the city, they were crucified. Their voices rose in hymns even as their blood soaked the earth. The first martyrs of Japan bore witness with silence and song, their bodies forming a question that hung over the land. What is stronger, the fear of death or the faith that endures beyond it? The martyrdom of the 26 was not yet the great wave of persecution that would come, but it was a warning carved in blood. Hideyoshi had shown that his suspicion could turn to steel, that the shadow could strike, and in doing so, he sealed a destiny. Christianity in Japan would never again be safe. It would live in fire, or it would live in hiding. Suspicion is a shadow that grows longer with the setting sun. At first it is only doubt, then it becomes fear, and at last it becomes violence. In Hideyoshi's heart, suspicion had taken root, and in that soil, the faith of Japan's Christians would be tested again and again until the silence of death or the endurance of memory revealed which seed was stronger. The wind on Nishizaka Hill carried the salt of the sea and the murmur of a crowd that had gathered not for celebration but for death. It was the 5th of February, 1597, and 26 prisoners, men, women, and children, were marched through the streets of Nagasaki. Their feet were raw from the long journey, their bodies scarred by humiliation, yet their eyes glimmered with something that no whip or chain could extinguish. The city watched in silence as the condemned passed. Some wept, others turned away in fear, while a few muttered curses at the foreigners who had brought this faith across the seas. But above all, the air was thick with awe, for these prisoners sang. Their voices, weak from hunger, rose in hymns that echoed against the hills. As the people listened, it seemed as though the very stones of Nagasaki carried the melody of the cross. The march had begun weeks earlier in Kyoto. Hideyoshi, angered by rumors that the missionaries conspired with foreign powers, had ordered the arrest of Christians to serve as a warning. His choice of victims was not random. Among them were 6 Franciscan missionaries, 3 Japanese Jesuits, and 17 Japanese lay believers, including carpenters, merchants, and children. They were paraded through the streets, their ears mutilated as a mark of shame, yet instead of despair, they sang hymns as they walked, their voices rising above the jeers of soldiers. Along the Tokaido Road, villagers watched in stunned silence as the chained procession passed by. The foreign faith now embodied not in foreign priests, but in Japanese men, women, and children who walked to death with dignity. Among them was a boy named Luis Ibaraki, only 12 years old. His small frame swayed with exhaustion, but his lips did not cease from prayer. When offered a chance to renounce his faith and live, he is said to have replied with words beyond his years, "I will not. I want to follow the same path as my companions." When at last they reached Nagasaki, the hill of execution loomed before them. Wooden crosses stood ready, their beams rough-hewn and waiting. The crowd pressed closer, a tide of humanity drawn to witness this spectacle. Soldiers bound each prisoner to a cross with ropes and iron rings. The youngest, Luis, was placed beside the elders so that the people might see the breadth of devotion from child to man, from peasant to priest. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, as the crosses were raised. One by one, the condemned lifted their voices in prayer. Some sang hymns, others whispered the names of Christ and Mary, their words carried by the wind across the city. The crowd, expecting cries of pain, instead heard a chorus of faith. The soldiers, unnerved, hesitated, but the order was given, and lances were driven into the sides of the martyrs. Blood ran down the wood, staining the earth below. Yet even as life drained from their bodies, their voices did not falter. The hymn Te Deum Laudamus, "We praise thee, O God," rose above the cries of the crowd, a song of triumph in the face of death. For Nagasaki's Christians, this was no ordinary execution. It was a revelation. The faith they had embraced was no longer a matter of trade or politics. It was no longer a question of daimyo strategy or foreign ships. It was life and death, silence and song, suffering and salvation. The hill itself became sacred. Mothers whispered to their children of the day when the martyrs sang as they died. Fathers carved small crosses into the soil, carrying bits of earth home as relics. And though Hideyoshi intended the spectacle to strike fear into the hearts of believers, it did the opposite. Faith, once tied to power, was now tied to sacrifice. Christianity had found its martyrs, and in their blood the seed of devotion was watered. The Jesuits chronicled the event in letters sent to Europe, their words trembling with grief and awe. "Never have I seen such constancy," one wrote. They went to death as to a wedding feast. The news spread across Christendom, inspiring prayers, paintings, and poetry. In Rome, the martyrs of Japan were hailed as saints in the making, proof that the gospel had taken root in the farthest corners of the world. But in Japan, the consequences were darker. Hideyoshi had shown his power, and the line was drawn. Christianity could no longer flourish openly. It would survive only in shadows, in whispers, in the silence of hidden prayers. Nishizaka Hill was both a beacon and a warning. As dusk fell, the crosses stood silent against the darkening sky, their beams marked with blood, their victims stilled in death, yet radiant in memory. The crowd dispersed, but none could forget the hymns that had filled the air. The soldiers wiped their lances clean, but their hands shook. Even the earth seemed changed, as though consecrated by sacrifice. The martyrs' bodies were left exposed as a warning, but to the faithful, they were more than corpses. They were witnesses, martyrs in the truest sense, whose voices would echo for centuries in the hearts of hidden believers. Nishizaka Hill would never again be ordinary ground. It would remain a place where silence spoke louder than power, and blood carried more weight than steel. Every age writes its truth in blood. Some deaths silence a movement, others give it voice. On Nishizaka Hill, 26 lives ended, yet their hymn continues still. What does it mean to kill for fear of faith, if the act of killing itself only makes the faith immortal? The death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598 left Japan once more in turmoil. Power shifted like sand, alliances splintered, and the great warlords measured their strength against one another. Out of this chaos rose a man whose name would shape centuries, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Patient, calculating, and unyielding, he would forge a shogunate that bound Japan in silence for more than 200 years. Yet within that silence, the question of Christianity lingered, unresolved, like an ember, refusing to die. Ieyasu was no zealot. Unlike Hideyoshi, he was not driven by sudden passions or erratic suspicion. He was a pragmatist, a ruler who measured men as carefully as he measured armies. When he looked upon the Christians of Japan, He did not see only heresy or threat. He saw opportunity and danger woven inseparably together. For Christianity brought trade. Portuguese ships filled the harbors with silver, silk, and weapons. Jesuit schools produced learned men. Christian daimyo offered loyalty in exchange for protection. Yet Ieyasu also saw the shadows, the allegiance to Rome, the whisper of rebellion, the memory of martyrs whose blood had turned death into testimony. And so, in the first years of his reign, the shogun chose silence. This silence was not ignorance, but strategy. He allowed missionaries to remain, but watched them closely. He permitted Christian daimyo to govern, but tested their loyalty. He welcomed Portuguese merchants, but negotiated equally with the Dutch and English, balancing foreign powers against one another. By playing the nations of the West against each other, Ieyasu ensured that none could dominate Japan. The Christians of Nagasaki breathed easier in those early years. Churches reopened, bells rang once more, and Mass was celebrated without fear. Jesuits and Franciscans worked zealously, baptizing thousands. The faithful rejoiced, believing that perhaps God had softened the heart of the new shogun. Some even whispered that Japan itself might yet become a Christian kingdom. But silence is never the same as acceptance. Ieyasu listened. He listened to Buddhist monks who warned that Christianity was a poison that eroded tradition. He listened to merchants who grumbled that Jesuits favored Portuguese trade over others. He listened to his own counselors who argued that a man could not serve two masters Christ and the shogun. He listened to the silence of the people themselves, who bent under the weight of suspicion even as they prayed. For every baptism, there was a report of unrest. For every convert, there was a warning of betrayal. The faith grew like ivy across the walls of Japan, beautiful to some, invasive to others. The shogun waited. He measured, and he prepared. The decisive moment came not with hymns, but with war. In 1600, at the Battle of Sekigahara, Ieyasu crushed his rivals and secured his path to power. Among those who opposed him were Christian daimyo, their banners marked with the cross. Though they fought for political reasons, their faith branded them in his eyes. Could he trust a religion that bound its lords to a foreign god? Could he risk that one day their loyalty would not be to Edo, but to Rome? The silence deepened. In 1614, Ieyasu issued the Christian expulsion edict. Missionaries were to leave Japan, churches were to be destroyed. Japanese Christians were ordered to renounce their faith or face punishment. It was a decree that ended the fragile dawn of tolerance. The edict struck like a hammer. Priests were hunted, churches dismantled, believers scattered. The faithful fled into forests, caves, and remote villages, carrying with them relics and fragments of scripture. The cross, once raised openly in Nagasaki, now hid in the folds of households, carved into the backs of rice spoons or disguised as Buddhist statues. And yet, even as the hammer fell, the ember endured. The hidden Christians, Kakure Kirishitan, emerged in silence. They whispered prayers in secret, taught children by night, baptized infants with stolen water. Their faith was no longer a public banner, but a secret heartbeat, carried in memory and ritual. Ieyasu's silence had ended, replaced by steel, but within the silence he imposed, another kind of silence was born, one that whispered in shadows, waiting for centuries. The Jesuits, driven out or executed, wrote their final letters with sorrow. The vineyard has been cut down, one lamented, but the roots remain. They could not know how true those words would prove, nor how many generations of Japanese would cling to fragments of their teaching in the long darkness to come. Ieyasu in his final years rested secure in his decision. His shogunate would endure, stable and unchallenged, for 250 years. He had chosen silence over chaos, unity over division. But history asks, at what cost? Silence can be a weapon as sharp as the sword. To permit nothing, to allow no voice, is to kill not with fire, but with emptiness. Yet silence cannot quench memory, nor can it erase belief. In Ieyasu's silence, Christianity did not vanish, it learned to whisper, and sometimes whispers last longer than shouts. Silence fell over Nagasaki after the expulsion edict of 1614. The churches that had once rung with hymns stood empty, their bells removed, their crosses torn down. Priests, hunted as enemies of the state, disappeared into exile, prison, or execution. The faithful who had once filled pews now faced a choice: renounce their God or conceal him. Most chose concealment. Thus was born one of the strangest and most haunting chapters in the history of faith, the age of the Kakure Kirishitan, the hidden Christians. Faith became a flame that could no longer burn openly. To survive, it had to glow in secret, faint yet enduring. Families gathered not in churches but in the dark corners of their homes. Mothers taught their children prayers and whispers, not Latin but Japanese, corrupted by generations of mishearing. The paternoster reshaped into strange syllables, yet carrying the same longing. Fathers carved crosses not on altars, but into the backs of rice spoons or beneath floorboards. Even statues of the Virgin Mary were disguised as canon. The Buddhist bodhisattva of mercy, her child in her arms concealed as an image of divine compassion that Japanese officials would not suspect. Faith became survival. Rituals transformed into codes. Baptism, once a public act of water and proclamation, became a secret gesture performed by parents at the birth of a child. The Eucharist vanished, for no priests remained to consecrate bread and wine. In its place, families shared meals that symbolized communion, telling their children stories of the Last Supper in words so blurred by time that they seemed half legend, half memory. The prayers, too, shifted. Latin was forgotten, but fragments endured. Ave Maria became Ave Maria, its rhythm preserved if not its meaning. The faithful recited them not in churches but in rice fields, along the shore, in whispers carried by the wind. Children learned to murmur them as lullabies, never knowing the original words but carrying forward the cadence of devotion. Yet secrecy brought fear. At any moment, an informant might betray them, a neighbor might suspect. The shogunate's inspectors roamed the land, carrying with them images of Christ and Mary known as fumi. These wooden or bronze plaques bore the likeness of the crucifixion or the Virgin. Suspected Christians were ordered to step upon them, to trample the holy images as proof of loyalty to the shogun. Those who refused were tortured, executed, or sent into exile. Those who complied lived on, but often with hearts shattered by guilt. And so the hidden Christians lived in the space between defiance and survival. Some risked their lives to protect their faith untouched. Others outwardly conformed, stepping on the fumi while clinging inwardly to prayer. Between them grew a strange grey faith, bent but unbroken, disguised yet enduring. Generations passed. Children grew up never seeing a priest, never hearing Mass in its fullness. They inherited prayers like broken heirlooms, half understood but wholly sacred. The story of Christ was told like a legend, his death and resurrection woven into the fabric of memory, as though he were both God and folk hero. For some, the details blurred into myth, yet the devotion remained fierce. Communities formed in secret. Leaders called chokate took on the role of guiding rituals, preserving what fragments of scripture they remembered. They baptized, they led prayers, they kept genealogies of faith. In the absence of the institutional church, Christianity in Japan transformed into something uniquely its own, a faith of shadows, stripped of form, but alive in spirit. For the shogunate, this survival was both baffling and infuriating. Edicts had been clear, punishments severe, yet still, rumors circulated of villages where the cross was hidden, of peasants who whispered forbidden prayers. The authorities cracked down with brutal efficiency, yet for every believer dragged to torture, another survived in silence. The hidden Christians became like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to extinguish, and in their secrecy they found strength. What had once been a foreign faith became, in the crucible of persecution, a Japanese faith, stripped of Latin, of priests, of Rome's guidance. It endured not through power, but through memory. It was no longer the religion of daimyo and merchants, but of peasants and fishermen, mothers and children. The faith that had once been a tool of politics now became a matter of survival. Centuries would pass this way. No churches rose, no bells rang, yet the hidden flame endured. In caves by the sea, families carved small shrines. In the mountains, crosses were etched into stones and left among moss and trees. The faithful lived outwardly as Buddhists or Shintoists, but their hearts carried a different prayer, a different dawn. Fire can burn openly, consuming the night with its light. But when pressed into shadows, it does not die, it smolders. Sometimes the flame hidden in silence is stronger than the fire that blazes in daylight. The hidden Christians carried such a flame, fragile, disguised, yet enduring through centuries of silence and fear. And though the shogunate sought to erase them, their whispers became more enduring than the shouts of power. The silence of the Tokugawa shogunate was not gentle. It was enforced by fire, steel, and bamboo. To believe was not only forbidden, it was punished, in ways designed not merely to kill the body but to break the soul. Christianity was no longer tested by words or persuasion. It was tested in dungeons, on hillsides, and in the chambers of pain. The fumi became the most infamous weapon of this persecution. Each year, in towns across Japan, officials carried plaques of Christ or the Virgin Mary, bronze, wood, or stone, their surfaces worn smooth by countless feet. Suspected Christians were summoned to step upon these holy images. For many, it was a small act, a simple gesture to prove loyalty to the shogun. But for believers, it was agony. To place one's foot upon the face of Christ was to trample one's soul, to renounce love, salvation, and memory in a single gesture. Some refused, trembling as they stared at the holy image, their lips whispering prayers. They were seized, dragged away, and tortured until their faith broke, or their bodies did. Others stepped upon the fumi, but wept afterward, their hearts crushed with guilt. Still, others pressed their foot lightly, as though hoping the gesture might fool both the officials and their own conscience. Each choice left scars, on the flesh, on the spirit, on the memory of a people. Beyond the fumi lay cruelties far more unspeakable. torture became an art of fear. The shogunate employed methods calculated to strip away hope. The water torture forced believers into agony by pouring water endlessly into their mouths and nostrils, drowning them without sea or river. The bamboo torture used sharpened splinters driven under fingernails, each thrust a reminder that even the smallest part of the body could become a battlefield. But the most dreaded was the anasurushi, the pit. Victims were bound and suspended upside down over a pit, their heads lowered into a hole filled with excrement and filth. A small cut was made behind the ear so the blood would drain slowly, prolonging consciousness. In this position, they endured not minutes or hours, but days, their minds unraveling under pain and humiliation. The goal was not death, but renunciation, and many did renounce. The shogunate understood that killing a martyr could inspire others, but breaking one, forcing him to deny his faith publicly, could shatter entire communities. The names of the tortured filled the records of Nagasaki, Edo, and Kyoto. Men, women, even children were subjected to these trials. Some died with hymns on their lips, refusing to surrender. Others faltered, only to spend the rest of their lives haunted by betrayal. Among the most famous was the Jesuit priest Cristovão Ferreira. After enduring the Anatsurushi in Nagasaki in 1633, he renounced his faith and became an informant for the shogunate. To the authorities, his apostasy was a triumph. To the hidden Christians, it was a wound deeper than death itself. The story of Ferreira echoed like a thunderclap. If even priests could fall, what hope did ordinary believers have? And yet, in that despair, the faith endured. For every Ferreira, there were countless nameless peasants who chose death over denial, whose bodies were swallowed by fire and sea, but whose names lived in whispered prayers. In villages, parents told their children of the tortures, not to terrify them, but to steel them. "This is the cost of faith," they said. "If the soldiers come, remember that Christ suffered first." Children grew up with fear in their bones, yet also with courage woven into their lullabies. The stories of the tortured became a strange inheritance, a grim catechism of endurance. The shogunate hoped that terror would erase Christianity. Instead, it reshaped it. Faith became less about doctrine, more about loyalty. To believe was not merely to hold ideas, it was to risk torment. Christianity in Japan became a religion of the cross, not in symbol, but in flesh. Still, the question lingered. What of those who broke? What of the apostates who stepped upon the fumi, who denied Christ to preserve their lives? Some were shunned, others quietly continued to pray in secret, their lips trembling with guilt. The line between faith and betrayal blurred in the darkness of the torture chambers. Who could say whether a man who faltered under the lash was truly faithless, or whether his whispered prayers after release still reached heaven? The cruelty of the Tokugawa persecution left scars that no generation could forget. Entire villages were emptied, churches burned, families shattered, yet amid the ashes, the hidden flame still glowed. Torture could break bodies, but it could not extinguish memory. Mothers still passed down prayers, fathers still carved hidden crosses. Children still learned to bow outwardly to Buddha, while secretly whispering to Christ. Pain is the most honest teacher of faith. It strips away illusions, leaving only the truth of what a soul can bear. Some break, some endure, but all are changed. In the fire and bamboo of Tokugawa, Japan, Christianity was transformed from a religion of power into a faith of scars. And sometimes scars endure longer than crowns. The greatest cruelty of persecution was not death. Death could be borne with dignity hymns upon the lips, and faith unbroken. The true cruelty was survival, the survival of those who faltered, for while martyrs became legends, apostates became living ghosts. They walked among their neighbors, ate with their families, but carried within them a silence heavier than chains, the knowledge that, when tested, they had denied their God. The fumi was deceptively simple, a wooden or bronze plaque, an image of Christ or Mary set upon the ground. Step upon it, the officials commanded, and you may go free. No flames, no blades, just a single gesture. Yet that gesture was a chasm. To place one's foot upon the holy image was to trample the very heart of belief. To refuse was to embrace torture, exile, or death. What is faith worth when measured against the scream of one's body? What is loyalty worth when one's children weep for bread, one's spouse begs for mercy? These were the questions that haunted every believer summoned to the fumi. Some resisted. Their feet never touched the sacred image. Their names entered history as martyrs, their blood watering the hidden flame of faith. But others, perhaps the majority, stepped, and in stepping, they did not find relief, but torment of another kind. They returned home alive, but hollow. Their neighbors knew. Some were shunned, whispered about as traitors. Others were pitied, their weakness understood but never forgotten. For many, the greatest punishment was not the state's decree, but the gnawing voice within their own conscience. Every prayer they tried to utter afterwards seemed poisoned. Every thought of Christ carried the memory of that moment when they chose survival over him. Among the most famous was Cristóvão Ferreira, once a Jesuit missionary of unshakable zeal. In 1633, after enduring the pit torture, he renounced his faith. The shogunate paraded his apostasy as proof of their victory, forcing him to take a Japanese name and even a Japanese wife. He wrote against Christianity, claiming it was folly unsuited to Japanese soil. For the faithful, his fall was a wound deeper than any blade. A priest who should have shepherded his flock had instead betrayed them. Yet, even Ferreira's story was tangled in ambiguity. Rumors spread that he secretly repented before his death, that his final words were prayers whispered into the silence. Was he a traitor, or a broken man who found his way back in the end? History leaves the answer in shadows, as though to remind us that faith and weakness often share the same fragile heart. For ordinary believers, the dilemma was even harsher. A father might step on the fumi to protect his children from starvation. A mother might deny her God to spare her infant from the torturer's hands. Were these betrayals or sacrifices of a different kind? The lines blurred, leaving wounds that no priest remained to heal. In hidden communities, such apostates were sometimes welcomed back, sometimes kept at arm's length. Some wept for years, repeating prayers in penance, carving crosses into their skin, begging forgiveness in the only ways they knew. Others turned bitter, convincing themselves that Christ had abandoned them first. In either case, their lives became testimonies, not of triumph, but of the terrible weight of choice. The Japanese word korobi, those who fell, came to describe such believers. Yet even in their fall, many did not abandon the faith entirely. They became a strange class of Christians who outwardly conformed, but inwardly longed for redemption. They attended Buddhist rituals by day, but whispered broken prayers at night. Their footsteps on the fumi echoed in their hearts forever. But in that echo, some clung still to the hope of mercy. The hidden Christians told their children stories not only of martyrs, but of apostates, For in those stories was a different kind of lesson, that faith is not always unshakable, that weakness is part of humanity, and that even those who faltered longed for grace. Some whispered that Christ himself, in his agony, had doubted for a moment on the cross. Could he not forgive them for doubting in theirs? The apostates' dilemma was more than personal. It was communal. Their choices forced entire villages to confront what it meant to be faithful. Was true devotion only for those who endured torture without breaking? Or could God still love those who stumbled, who trampled the image, yet wept afterward? Without priests, without sacraments, the answers were left in the hearts of the people, fragile and uncertain. And so, across generations, the memory of the apostates lingered. Their shame was whispered, their names sometimes cursed, sometimes pitied. Yet in their stories, Christianity in Japan took on a human face, not only radiant with the courage of martyrs, but scarred with the frailty of ordinary men and women. Faith shines brightest in the fire, but shadows remain even in the flame. The martyrs show us the heights of devotion, but the apostates show us the depths of weakness. And perhaps, in those depths, lies a truth no less profound. That faith is not only about never falling, it is about what remains in the heart even after the fall. Do we judge the broken, or do we listen to the silence of their regret? In the dilemma of the apostates, Japan's Christians found not only sorrow, but the reminder that faith is as fragile as it is enduring. The winter winds howled across the waters of Kyushu in 1637. Fishermen in their boats heard not only the crash of waves, but also the distant cries of rebellion rising from the Shimabara Peninsula. Hunger had become sharper than steel, taxation heavier than chains, and among the peasants and ronin who gathered to fight, many carried more than anger, they carried the cross. For years, the land had groaned beneath the weight of oppression. The Matsukura clan, charged with ruling Shimabara, had bled the peasants with unbearable taxes to fund castles and ambitions. Fields lay barren, families starved, and mothers wept over empty bowls. In such darkness whispers spread, the God of the Christians had not abandoned them. His justice would rise. His Son would deliver. It was a fragile hope, but desperation can turn hope into fire. Armed with farming tools, stolen weapons, and banners painted with crosses, peasants joined forces with ronin masterless samurai stripped of honor and livelihood. Together they marched beneath the sign of Christ, though for many the faith was a memory half remembered, a prayer passed down in fragments. Yet, in the heat of rebellion, it was enough. The cross became a banner of defiance, a symbol not only of religion but of survival itself. At the heart of the uprising stood a boy, Amakusa Shiro. Barely 16, his presence seemed almost divine. Handsome, eloquent, and aflame with conviction, he was hailed as the heavenly messenger. Legends claimed he could work miracles, that he was chosen by God to lead his people. Whether prophet or symbol, his figure united the desperate masses. Under Shiro's banner, the rebels seized castles and repelled shogunate forces in the early days. Their voices rose in hymns as they fought, ancient Latin prayers mixed with Japanese chants. Farmers who had never seen a church now fought for Christ as though his name were their only shield. In the cold air of Kyushu, the rebellion burned like a sudden fire. But fire attracts storms. The Tokugawa shogunate could not allow such defiance to spread. They sent armies, tens of thousands of soldiers against the ragged band of peasants and ronin. The rebels, vastly outnumbered, retreated to the ruins of Hara Castle, a fortress perched against the sea. There they made their stand. The siege was brutal. Waves of shogunate troops crashed against the castle walls, only to be repelled by desperate defenders hurling stones, boiling water, and stolen powder. Inside the fortress, hymns echoed in the night, mingled with the cries of children. Mothers prayed over starving infants, fathers sharpened rusted blades, and all waited for the inevitable. Winter deepened. Food dwindled. The rebels ate roots, bark, and the flesh of their horses. Disease spread, yet still they refused to surrender. Amakusa Shiro moved among them, whispering of heaven, of crowns that awaited the faithful beyond death. His words kept hope alive, even as bodies weakened. At sea, silence held its breath. The rebels had no ships to flee, and the shogunate blockaded the coast. The waters that once carried foreign priests and Portuguese traders now lay empty, indifferent to the cries of those trapped within the castle walls. The sea watched, cold and merciless, as faith and desperation clashed upon its shore. After months of siege, the end came in blood. In April 1638, the shogunate launched its final assault. Cannons thundered, walls crumbled, and soldiers poured into the fortress. What followed was massacre. 37,000 rebels, men, women, children, were slaughtered. The cries of the dying filled the ruins, rising above the waves before silence claimed them. Amakusa Shiro himself was captured. His body was displayed as a warning, his severed head nailed to a pike in Nagasaki. The shogunate proclaimed victory, but in that victory, something darker was sealed. The Shimabara rebellion was not merely crushed, it was erased. Christianity, already outlawed, was now equated with treason. To believe was not simply to defy the gods of Japan, it was to rebel against the shogun himself. From that day forward, Christianity was hunted with renewed fury. The Fiume inspections grew harsher, the tortures more merciless. The faith retreated deeper into the shadows, its survival now more miraculous than ever. And the sea, which had once carried missionaries and trade, became complicit in silence. No foreign ships would bring priests again. The Sakoku policy, Japan's national seclusion, tightened like a noose. The waters around Japan became both shield and prison, keeping the world out and keeping the faith locked in shadows. For the survivors, memory itself became a kind of rebellion. Mothers told their children of Shiro, the boy who shone like a star and fell like a martyr. Fathers whispered of the cross raised above the battlefield, of hymns sung even as cannons roared. Though the shogunate declared the rebellion treason, the people remembered it as sacrifice. And so, even in massacre, the hidden flame endured. Silence spread across the seas, but within that silence, whispers survived. Silence at sea is never empty. Beneath the still waters lie voices of the drowned, prayers of the desperate, and the memory of fire extinguished in blood. The Shimabara rebellion was crushed, but its echoes carried across centuries. For in the silence left behind, the question remained, can faith ever truly be killed if it survives in memory? After the blood-soaked ruins of Hara Castle, the shogunate resolved that never again would such defiance be allowed to take root. To them, Christianity was no longer merely a foreign religion, it was rebellion itself, a contagion that threatened the stability of the realm. If faith had spread through ships and merchants, then ships and merchants must be controlled. If voices from beyond the sea had brought fire to Japan, then the sea itself must be sealed. Thus began Sakoku, the closed country policy. In 1639, the Tokugawa shogunate expelled the Portuguese, severing the last link between Japan and the missionaries of Europe. Only the Dutch, confined to the man-made island of Dejima in Nagasaki, were permitted to remain, their presence tolerated because they cared for trade but not for souls. The great harbors of Japan, once alive with sails and foreign tongues, fell silent. The sea that had carried fire now became a wall of water, encircling the nation in isolation. The edicts were harsh and absolute. No Japanese could leave the country under pain of death. No foreigner could enter without permission. Those who attempted to return from voyages abroad were executed, lest foreign ideas infect the land. Christianity was banned with renewed severity. Rewards were given for informants who exposed believers. The Fumi inspections became annual rituals of loyalty, repeated until the very images of Christ were worn smooth by centuries of trampling. And so Japan was sealed, its people contained, its faiths controlled, its borders hardened against the world. Yet the sealing of the nation did not mean the sealing of memory. Within the silence of Sakoku, the hidden Christians endured. Cut off from Rome, from priests, from scripture, they became custodians of fragments. Their faith was transformed into something both fragile and resilient, shaped by necessity into new forms. Without priests to guide them, they baptized their own children. Without churches, they turned their homes into sanctuaries. Without images of Christ, they disguised the Virgin Mary as canon, the bodhisattva of mercy, cradling her child in a way that only the faithful recognized as the Madonna and Child. Faith survived in shadows, hidden not only from officials but sometimes even from neighbors. The shogunate, for its part, considered the problem solved. Reports assured Edo that Christianity had been eradicated. The martyrs were dead, the priests gone, the foreign ships banished. The land was unified, ordered, secure. Samurai patrolled villages to enforce loyalty, Buddhist temples kept family registers to monitor the people, and silence reigned. But silence is never total. Beneath the official records, in remote fishing hamlets and mountain villages, whispers continued. Prayers distorted by generations still carried the rhythm of the Ave Maria. Children were taught secret gestures of the cross, disguised as everyday movements. In lullabies and folk songs, fragments of the gospel were hidden like jewels buried beneath the soil. Generations grew up knowing no priests, no sacraments, no Rome. For them, Christianity was not an organized religion, but a legacy of memory. They knew of a God who loved them, of a son who suffered, of a mother who wept, though their stories were wrapped in layers of distortion and disguise. To outsiders, their practices seemed strange, even heretical. But to the hidden Christians, they were lifelines to a truth too precious to surrender. And perhaps it was precisely because of the sealing of Japan that the faith endured. Had missionaries continued openly, perhaps Christianity would have remained tied to politics and trade. But in silence, it became a religion of the heart, stripped of power, purified by survival. The irony of Sakoku was this. By sealing the nation to protect it from foreign influence, the shogunate unwittingly preserved within it a seed they could not uproot. Christianity became not a foreign threat, but a hidden inheritance passed quietly from parent to child. The nation was sealed, but within the seal, the flame still smoldered. For more than 2 centuries, Japan remained closed. The world changed. Europe fought wars, discovered lands, launched revolutions, but Japan turned inward, its silence unbroken. On the surface, the policy was a success. No rebellion rose, no foreign army landed, no rival religion flourished. Yet, beneath that stillness, faith persisted in ways no edict could fully control. To seal a nation is to believe that silence can erase memory, but memory is a seed that does not die in silence, it waits. The sea may wall out ships, the law may burn churches, but the heart has its own harbor. In the age of Sakoku, Japan's silence became a paradox. It extinguished Christianity's voice, yet preserved its echo for centuries to come. When the shogunate sealed Japan and outlawed the faith, it did not destroy Christianity, it forced it to transform, denied priests, churches, and scripture. The hidden Christians built a new language for survival, not the language of Rome nor the chants of grand cathedrals, but a language of shadows, whispers disguised as folk songs, prayers buried in lullabies, rituals woven into the fabric of daily life. Faith, stripped of formality, became code. The Ave Maria survived, but twisted by centuries into strange syllables. Ave Maria, gratia plena. To outsiders, these words were nonsense. To the faithful, they were the heartbeat of devotion. The Paternoster became Bate Runo Sutta, a chant whose meaning had blurred, but whose cadence preserved memory. The prayers were no longer understood in their entirety, yet their rhythm carried a sacred familiarity, like the echo of a forgotten melody. Parents taught these words to children as lullabies, rocking them to sleep with syllables that carried centuries of faith. Infants grew up hearing prayers before they even understood words, so that by the time they could speak, devotion was already planted in their tongues. The prayers no longer belonged to priests, they belonged to families. Symbols, too, were reshaped. Crosses were carved into household tools or hidden within patterns of fabric. Icons of the Virgin were disguised as statues of Canon, the Bodhisattva of mercy, her child in her arms, easily mistaken for the infant Buddha. To the unknowing eye, these were Buddhist relics. To the faithful, they were signs of Mary's presence, guardians of their secret devotion. Even the sacraments were adapted. Baptism, once a solemn ritual performed by a priest, became a duty passed from father to mother to elder to midwife. At the birth of a child, water was poured gently on the head, prayers whispered in distorted Latin, and the child was welcomed into the hidden faith. There was no church, no altar, yet the flame of belief was passed down, generation by generation. Marriage rites were disguised as folk customs. Death rites became chants at funerals, their Christian origins hidden beneath Buddhist ritual forms. To the authorities, the families looked like loyal temple-goers. To the faithful, every bow, every song carried double meaning. The hidden Christians called their prayers oratio, derived from the Latin oratio, meaning prayer. These oratio became the lifeblood of their faith. Though the meaning of the words was often lost, the act of reciting them bound communities together. In small gatherings at night, families would chant the oratio in rhythm, voices low, candles hidden. The sound was hypnotic, a hum of memory and faith, like the pulse of a people who refused to vanish. In this language of shadows, even silence spoke. A mother crossing her child's forehead with water as though brushing away sweat. A fisherman tracing the shape of the cross over his net before casting it into the sea, disguised as a gesture of luck. A child bowing before a Canon statue, whispering words that to outsiders seemed Buddhist, but in truth were prayers to Mary. This hidden language had its dangers. Over generations, distortions grew. Without priests to guide them, some rituals drifted from their original meanings. Elements of Buddhism and Shinto fused with Christianity, creating a hybrid faith unique to Japan. Some communities even came to believe that Mary was not only the mother of Christ, but a divine being in her own right, merging with the merciful canon. For Rome, centuries later, this would appear as heresy. but for the hidden Christians it was necessity. Faith had to bend to survive, and in its bending it took on new shapes. Yet beneath the distortions, the essence remained: devotion to Christ, memory of his sacrifice, and hope of salvation. The words might be broken, the images disguised, the sacraments incomplete, but the heart of belief endured. For the shogunate, the silence seemed complete. Officials recorded the faith as eradicated, the people as loyal to temples. But in the corners of homes, in the rhythm of songs, in the lull of prayers spoken over rice bowls and graves, Christianity persisted in forms no official could ever fully grasp. This was the paradox of the hidden Christians. Their faith survived not by standing tall, but by bowing, bending, blending into the shadows. What looked like surrender was, in truth, endurance. What looked like silence was, in truth, a language more enduring than words. Faith does not always survive in clarity. Sometimes it lives in distortion, in fragments, in whispers. Yet even broken words can carry devotion. Even disguised images can preserve memory. In the language of shadows, Japan's Christians spoke across centuries, not to the ears of power, but to the hearts of their children. And perhaps that is the truest language of all. Time is the most relentless of persecutors. It wears away stone, silences voices, and reshapes truth into fragments. For the hidden Christians of Japan, time was both an enemy and an ally. It threatened to erase their faith, yet it also carried it forward from one generation to the next in the fragile vessel of memory. By the 18th century, more than 100 years had passed since missionaries last walked openly in Japan. No priests remained to teach doctrine. No Mass was celebrated as the Church had ordained. The sacraments, those pillars of faith, had faded, replaced by imitations born of necessity. And yet, the memory of Christ endured, carried like a relic in the minds of peasants and fishermen who clung to what little their ancestors had preserved. For many, Christianity was no longer a structured religion, but a story. They remembered a God who loved humanity, a son who suffered upon a cross, and a mother who wept. They remembered water poured upon heads at birth, chants whispered at death, and prayers recited at meals. But the theology that once explained these rituals was gone. What remained was memory weighty, sacred, yet incomplete. In village gatherings, the elders told tales of the martyrs, of the 26 who sang as they died on Nishizaka Hill, of the peasants who raised the cross at Shimabara, of Amakusa Shiro, the boy prophet who defied the shogun. These stories were told with the rhythm of legend, their details blurred by time. Some believed Shiro had ascended to heaven like Christ, others that he would return one day to deliver the faithful. Fact and myth intertwined until they were inseparable. But for the faithful, the distinction mattered little. What mattered was hope. Children grew up hearing these tales, not as history lessons, but as moral compass. They learned that faith required courage, that suffering could be sanctified, that even in silence, God listened. In this way, Christianity became less an institution and more a folklore of endurance, a cultural memory hidden in the soil of Japan. The burden of this memory was heavy. Without priests, the people could not know whether their distorted rituals still carried divine grace. Did their baptisms still count? Did their prayers still reach heaven when the words were broken? Were they still Christians? Or had they unknowingly become something else? These questions haunted them. Yet they continued, because to abandon the rituals was to abandon their ancestors. Memory became sacred not only for faith's sake, but for loyalty to family. A child who forgot the Orasho was not only neglecting God, but betraying generations who had died to preserve it. The flame of belief thus became entwined with the flame of ancestry. To keep the faith alive was to honor the dead, and to break it was to dishonor centuries of sacrifice. In this way, memory itself became the faith. Where doctrine faltered, story sustained. Where theology blurred, loyalty endured. The hidden Christians lived in the tension between forgetting and remembering, their religion fragile yet unyielding. Outsiders, had they looked, might not have recognized it as Christianity at all. The prayers were distorted, the rituals fused with Buddhist and Shinto practices, the icons disguised. And yet, beneath the layers of adaptation, the essence remained: devotion to a God of mercy, a Christ who suffered, and a community bound by the weight of remembrance. The shogunate, confident in its suppression, believed Christianity had vanished. Officials conducted their Fumi inspections year after year, convinced the faith was no more than ashes. But they could not see what lay beneath the surface. The ashes still glowed. Each whispered prayer, each disguised statue, each tale of martyrs was a spark kept alive in the memory of the people. And memory, once carried long enough, becomes unkillable. Time transforms faith into memory, and memory into legend. Yet even legends can carry truth. The hidden Christians bore a faith that was fractured, blurred, even unrecognizable to outsiders, but in their memories of suffering, of sacrifice, of whispered prayers, they preserve something greater than doctrine, the endurance of hope. And perhaps hope, even when carried in fragments, weighs more than certainty. When voices are silenced, objects begin to speak. For Japan's hidden Christians, faith could no longer live in churches, nor be proclaimed in hymns that rang across the harbor. It had to hide in plain sight, concealed in the humblest of things. Thus, icons were born ordinary objects that whispered extraordinary truths to those who knew how to see. The most haunting of these were the Maria Cannon statues. To an official or a Buddhist neighbor, they were nothing more than serene images of Cannon, the bodhisattva of mercy, cradling a child in her arms. But to the faithful, they were the Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ. The face was carved in Buddhist style, the robes flowing as Japanese sculptors knew best, yet the essence was unmistakable. The hidden Christians prayed before these statues, knowing that their enemies could not distinguish the disguise. To bow before Cannon was to bow before Mary. To whisper Abe Mariah was to sanctify the deception. Rosaries too survived, though no longer strung with polished beads. Instead, they were fashioned from seeds, shells, or knotted cords. To an outsider, they looked like trinkets, tokens of no consequence. But in the hands of believers, each bead carried weight, each touch carried prayer. A fisherman fingering a necklace of seeds on the shore was, in truth, counting his orasho. A child playing with a string of shells was unknowingly rehearsing the rhythm of devotion. Even the simplest household tools became vessels of faith. Wooden spoons bore tiny crosses carved into their handles. Rice bowls were etched with patterns that, when turned in the light, revealed Christian symbols. Farmers etched crosses on plow handles, believing the God of their ancestors would bless their harvest. These objects carried no glory, no gold or silver, but in their ordinariness lay their strength. They could pass through inspections unnoticed, yet to the faithful they were relics as holy as any saint's bone. In Nagasaki and its surrounding villages, relics of an earlier age were treasured in silence. Pieces of old rosaries, pages of scripture smuggled centuries before, Fragments of chalices all were hidden in clay jars or beneath floorboards, passed down as sacred heirlooms. Families risked their lives to preserve these fragments, not for their material worth, but because they were threads connecting them to a larger story, a church that they had not seen for generations but still believed existed beyond the sea. The whispering icons spoke most powerfully in moments of fear. During the annual Fumi inspections, when families were summoned to trample the holy images presented by the shogunate, believers returned home with heavy hearts. There they would kneel before their hidden statues, their seed rosaries, their disguised Marys, and whisper prayers for forgiveness. The state demanded betrayal. The icons offered absolution. In this way, the objects became more than symbols, they became companions. They carried the faith when voices faltered, when memories blurred. They were tangible proof that belief had not been extinguished, that it could survive even when buried beneath centuries of silence. But these icons were not only whispers of devotion, they were also whispers of transformation. Over time, the disguises became so perfect that even the faithful sometimes blurred the line between canon and Mary, between Buddhist compassion and Christian mercy. Some prayed to Mary as if she were both the mother of Christ and a bodhisattva. Some saw no contradiction in blending the cross with the lotus, the rosary with Buddhist chants. The objects that once served as camouflage became bridges, weaving together traditions in ways no priest could have foreseen. The world outside Japan had long forgotten these hidden relics. In Europe, the faithful prayed for the martyrs, but few imagined that their brothers and sisters in Japan were bowing before seed rosaries and Maria Cannon statues. To Rome, Christianity was a universal structure of liturgy and law. To the hidden Christians, it had become a faith that whispered through objects and shadows. And yet, both bore the same essence: the longing for God, the hope of salvation, the endurance of memory. When words are forbidden, objects speak. The icons of the hidden Christians were not grand cathedrals or gilded chalices, but spoons, seeds, and statues carved in disguise. Yet perhaps these whispered louder than any sermon, for they proved that faith does not live in monuments, it lives in the hands that hold it, in the hearts that remember. And so, the whispering icons carried the flame of belief through centuries of silence, until the world was ready to listen again. The 18th century dawned quietly over Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled with iron order, its peace maintained by laws as rigid as stone. Samurai polished their swords, though battles were long past. Merchants thrived in the growing cities, peasants bent beneath their taxes, and Buddhist temples recorded the names of every family to prove their loyalty. On the surface, the realm was harmonious. The foreign faith that once caused such turmoil was, in the eyes of the shogunate, gone crushed, erased, forgotten, and yet silence is never empty. Beneath the stillness of rice fields, in fishing hamlets along the coast, in remote valleys where inspectors seldom came, an echo endured. The hidden Christians, descendants of those who had once worshipped openly in Nagasaki, still whispered their prayers. No priests guided them, no scriptures clarified their teachings, yet their rituals lived on, carried like faint voices across the gulf of time. Their gatherings were small, often in secret rooms or remote shrines. Families met at night, closing shutters, dousing lanterns, and reciting the orasho. The words had changed, warped by centuries, but the rhythm carried memory. Children listened, repeating syllables they did not understand, yet knowing they were sacred. Elders spoke of martyrs long dead as though they were ancestors still watching. In these hidden meetings, silence itself became part of the ritual. Voices dropped low, footsteps were muted, even children were taught to cry softly. Faith lived not in proclamation, but in the discipline of secrecy. Silence was their sanctuary, as holy as any church. For many, Christianity had become less theology than inheritance. Few could explain the Trinity, fewer still knew the sacraments as the Church intended, but they knew the stories of Christ who suffered, of Mary who interceded, of martyrs who sang on crosses. They carried the memory of baptism with water, of prayers at the hour of death, of sacred objects hidden in households. Faith endured not in clarity, but in fragments stitched together by loyalty and love. Some communities even fused their rituals with Shinto festivals or Buddhist chants. To outsiders, their prayers looked like ordinary folk customs, indistinguishable from village traditions. Yet within the words, within the gestures, meaning lingered. To bow before a canon statue was for them to honor Mary. To chant a Buddhist-style hymn was for them to remember the saints. The shogunate believed it had succeeded. Reports from officials claimed the Christian faith had vanished. Temples recorded baptisms as Buddhist ceremonies, funerals followed proper rites, and villagers outwardly conformed. Generations grew up knowing nothing of open rebellion, nothing of foreign priests. To Edo, the silence was victory, but to the hidden Christians, silence was survival. Their faith had become so deeply embedded in secrecy that even they began to wonder whether they were still Christians in the true sense or something else entirely. Some longed for priests who might return one day to guide them, to tell them whether their prayers were valid, whether God still heard. Others accepted that their version of Christianity was all they had, and that God in his mercy must surely understand. The 18th and early 19th centuries were centuries of waiting. Waiting for the world to change, waiting for ships to appear on the horizon, waiting for a sign that the silence might end. For more than 200 years, the faithful endured in this twilight. Children grew old, never knowing anything but whispers. Elders died, still clinging to fragments of prayers whose meanings had faded like worn ink. And yet, against all odds, the flame endured. Sometimes, silence becomes more powerful than words. The very absence of open churches made the faith more precious. Every prayer carried the weight of danger. Every ritual felt like rebellion. For the hidden Christians, survival itself was proof of God's presence. If he had abandoned them, surely the faith would have died. That it endured, even distorted, was evidence that he still listened. Silence is not nothingness. It is memory stretched across time, an echo that refuses to fade. In the 18th century, Japan's Christians seemed forgotten, their voices lost to history. Yet in secret homes and hidden valleys, their echo lived on. And sometimes echoes last longer than the shouts that first created them. The sea that had long walled Japan away from the world could not remain sealed forever. By the 19th century, sails and smoke once more appeared on the horizon ships from nations eager to pry open the island nation. For more than 2 centuries, Japan had lived in silence, convinced that Christianity was a memory fading into myth. But as the world pressed against its borders, that silence began to tremble, and within it the hidden flame of faith flickered, preparing to reveal itself again. It began with ships. In the early 1802, Russian vessels appeared off the northern coasts, probing Japan's defenses. Later, British and American whalers docked in remote harbors, testing the shogunate's resolve. The Dutch, long confined to Dejima, whispered of global changes, the expansion of empire, the wars of Europe, the revolutions across the seas. And then, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with his black ships, cannons glinting in the sun, demanding the opening of Japan. The world had come knocking, and Japan could not remain sealed. Treaties were signed, reluctantly at first, then in a flood. Foreigners entered ports long closed, and with them came merchants, diplomats, and quietly missionaries. For the hidden Christians, this was both miracle and terror. For generations, they had prayed in secret, unsure whether their rituals still bound them to the God they loved. They had no priests, no sacraments, no certainty, yet they preserved memory in lullabies and rituals. Now, suddenly, foreign priests returned, men who spoke of Rome, who carried crucifixes, who celebrated Mass as their ancestors had once known. But to reveal themselves was dangerous. The shogunate still forbade Christianity, still punished the faithful. Could they trust these foreigners? Were they truly the shepherds their ancestors had longed for, or another test from the state? The hidden Christians waited, their whispers trembling on the edge of revelation. In Nagasaki, the French priest Bernard Thaddeus Petitchin built the Ura Church in 1864, dedicated to the memory of the martyrs. It was meant for foreign residents, not for Japanese. Yet one day, in March 1865, a small group of villagers approached the church. Hesitant, trembling, they whispered to the priest, "Our hearts are the same as yours." It was the great discovery. After 250 years, the hidden Christians revealed themselves, showing that they had preserved their faith in secret through centuries of persecution. They asked the priest about Mary, about the Pope in Rome, about priests who could baptize. Tears fell as Petitchin realized the miracle before him. Faith had survived in silence, carried across generations by peasants who had never seen a priest, who had never read scripture, yet who had never forgotten. Word spread quickly. More hidden Christian communities emerged, cautiously at first. Then, with greater boldness, entire villages confessed their secret heritage. Priests who thought they were planting new seeds discovered instead an ancient root still alive beneath the soil. The faith that Rome had presumed lost was alive, though transformed. For some, reunion with the Catholic Church was joyous. They embraced the sacraments again, their rituals restored, their doubts eased, but others hesitated. Centuries of adaptation had shaped their faith into something uniquely Japanese. Their prayers, their icons, their rituals, these were not recognized by Rome, yet they were precious. To abandon them felt like betraying their ancestors. Thus arose a tension. Some hidden Christians rejoined the church, while others chose to remain apart, continuing their secret traditions even in freedom. The dawn of return was therefore bittersweet. It was the fulfillment of centuries of longing, yet it was also the revelation of how far the faith had changed in isolation. What was true Christianity, and what was the memory of Christianity transformed into folklore? These questions lingered, even as bells rang once more in Nagasaki. Still, the moment was miraculous. The silence of centuries had not killed the flame. Instead, it had preserved it, like an ember hidden beneath ash, waiting for the breath of wind to stir it into fire once more. Dawn does not erase the night, it reveals what endured through its darkness. The hidden Christians of Japan emerged in the light of the 19th century, not as new converts, but as survivors of memory. Their faith was not perfect, not unbroken, but it endured, and in its endurance it posed a question that still echoes. Is faith defined by purity of doctrine, or by the courage to remember in silence? On a quiet spring day in March 1865, The bells of the newly built Ora church rang across Nagasaki's harbor. The church itself was a marvel, its white walls gleaming, its Gothic spires pointing heavenward, its altar adorned with candles and statues that few Japanese eyes had ever seen. Built by French missionaries of the Paris Foreign Missions Society, it stood as a monument to the martyrs of Nishizaka Hill, whose blood still haunted the city's memory. To the shogunate, it was tolerated only as a chapel for foreigners. To the missionaries, it was a fragile beginning, a hope that perhaps one day Japan would again open its heart to Christ. They could not have imagined that the faith they thought extinguished had never died. On that day, as Father Bernard Thaddeus Petitjean prayed before the altar, he noticed a small group of Japanese villagers standing outside the church. They were from Urakami, a nearby village known for its suspicion of outsiders. Their faces were cautious, their bodies hesitant, as though torn between fear and longing. At last, they entered, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The priest greeted them gently, unsure of their purpose. Then one of the women stepped forward. She pointed to the statue of the Virgin Mary and whispered words that would echo across history. "Our hearts are the same as yours." Petitjean froze. For a moment, he thought he had misheard. Yet the villagers pressed closer, their eyes brimming with tears. They asked 3 questions. Did he honor Santa Maria? Did he follow the Pope in Rome? Did he have priests who were not married? With each answer yes, the villagers wept. For 2.5 centuries they had preserved fragments of faith in secret. Now in this French priest, they saw proof that their prayers had not been in vain. The faith of their ancestors was alive beyond the sea, and they were not alone. The encounter was like a miracle. Petitjean himself wrote, "It seemed to me that I was witnessing the resurrection of the church in Japan." Word spread quickly, and soon more villagers revealed themselves. Entire communities confessed their secret heritage. They brought with them objects preserved through generations: seed rosaries, Maria, canon statues, prayer books copied by hand, rituals carried in memory. They recited the orasho, their prayers distorted yet recognizable, their syllables bearing the weight of centuries. The missionaries, overwhelmed, wept alongside them. They had expected to plant new seeds of faith. Instead, they discovered an ancient tree, gnarled and bent by storms, yet still alive. The revelation shocked the Catholic world. News traveled to Rome, where Pope Pius IX declared it a miracle, the great discovery of the hidden Christians. In Europe, paintings and poems celebrated their endurance. Priests told the story in sermons, inspiring awe and devotion. For centuries, it had been assumed that Christianity in Japan had perished. Now it was clear. The flame had endured, hidden in shadows, preserved by peasants and mothers, fishermen and children, who had never seen a priest yet, refused to forget. But for the hidden Christians themselves, the moment was bittersweet. Some embraced reunion with Rome eagerly, grateful to be reconnected with sacraments and priests. They confessed their sins of trampling the Fiumi, begged for forgiveness, and received communion for the first time in generations. Their tears fell upon the altar like rain after a long drought. Others, however, hesitated. Centuries of adaptation had given their faith a unique shape. Their orasho, their icons, their rituals, they were not recognized by Rome, yet they were precious, sanctified by the sacrifices of their ancestors. To abandon them felt like betrayal. Some communities chose not to rejoin the Catholic Church, instead continuing their hidden traditions in secrecy, even when it was no longer necessary. For them, the survival of their unique faith was itself the holiest inheritance. The shogunate, still clinging to power in its final years, reacted with fear. News of the hidden Christians' return spread rapidly, and persecution flared once more. Thousands were arrested, tortured, or exiled. Families from Urakami were scattered across Japan, their faith tested yet again in the twilight of the Tokugawa era. Only with the Meiji Restoration in 1873 was Christianity finally legalized, allowing the faithful to emerge without fear. By then, the world had changed, and so had Japan. Yet the miracle of 1,865 remained. The revelation that silence had not killed faith, but preserved it like a jewel buried in the earth, waiting to be unearthed. Discovery is not always the finding of something new. It is the recognition of something that endured unseen. The hidden Christians, emerging after centuries, remind us that silence is not absence. Faith can be broken, bent, disguised, yet still live on. And when the dawn finally breaks, what was once hidden whispers loudly to the world, "We endured, and our hearts are the same as yours." In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate fell, and with it collapsed 2.5 centuries of rigid order. The Meiji Restoration swept across Japan like a storm, tearing down the old structures of power and thrusting the nation into modernity. Samurai sheathed their swords for the last time, railways and telegraphs appeared, and the once sealed country opened its gates to the world. Amid this transformation, Christianity, long forbidden, was at last brought into the open. In 1873, the ban was lifted. After centuries of silence, the cross could be raised without fear of torture, without the shadow of the Fumi. Bells once again rang in Nagasaki, this time not in secret, but in celebration. For the Catholic Church, it was a triumph proof that endurance had borne fruit, that the martyrs had not died in vain. For the hidden Christians, it was both joy and disquiet, for legalization brought not only freedom, but also choices that tested their identity. Many hidden Christian communities returned to the Catholic fold. Priests from Europe, joined by Japanese converts, worked tirelessly to reconcile the fragmented faith of the shadows with the universal traditions of Rome. Baptisms were performed anew, marriages sanctified, confessions heard after centuries of silence. For these communities, the return felt like homecoming. They wept as they received the Eucharist, believing they had been exiles brought back to the true church. But others hesitated or refused. Their faith, preserved in secrecy, had grown into something different, something uniquely Japanese. Their orasho, their Maria Cannon statues, their seed rosaries were more than relics, they were the lifeblood of their survival. To give them up felt like erasing the sacrifices of their ancestors. Could the Church, in Rome, however holy, understand the holiness of prayers whispered in distortion, of rituals disguised in shadows, of faith preserved not by doctrine but by memory? Thus, some communities chose to remain apart, continuing their traditions as Kakure Kirishitan even after the ban was gone. They saw themselves as guardians of a heritage sanctified not by Rome's approval, but by centuries of suffering. In their eyes, their ancestors had kept the faith alive when no priests remained, when no sacraments could be offered. To abandon those traditions was to abandon the very proof of God's endurance. The Meiji government, for its part, tolerated Christianity as part of its drive to modernize and prove itself to Western powers. Churches were allowed, schools established, and missionaries welcomed. Yet suspicion lingered. Nationalists warned that Christianity was still a foreign influence, an import that threatened the essence of Japan. Buddhist and Shinto leaders, long entwined with the nation's identity, watched the return of the faith with wary eyes. The paradox deepened. To the outside world, Japan's legalization of Christianity was a sign of progress, a symbol of modern freedom. But within Japan, the faith was still marked by centuries of tension. It was both a religion of martyrs and a reminder of foreign intrusion. It was both a faith reborn and a scar that never fully healed. For the hidden Christians themselves, the Meiji era was a time of profound reflection. Families gathered to decide, would they embrace the church openly or continue in secrecy? Grandparents recalled the whispered rituals of their youth, while children, seeing priests and churches for the first time, marveled at how different their inherited faith seemed from this newly revealed Christianity. For some, the church offered clarity and structure. For others, it seemed alien, unfamiliar, after centuries of a faith born in shadows. In this new Japan, Christianity became a faith of choices. It was no longer imposed by daimyo, no longer outlawed by shoguns, no longer hidden in lullabies. It was free, yet with freedom came division. Some chose Rome, others chose memory, and both claimed to honor the same God. And yet, perhaps this too was part of the faith's endurance. For the martyrs of Nishizaka, for the peasants of Shimabara, for the hidden Christians who clung to seed rosaries in silence, survival itself had always been the miracle. That their descendants could now argue about the true form of faith was, in its own way, a testament that the flame had not gone out. Freedom is never the end of struggle. It is the beginning of a new kind. The hidden Christians of the Meiji era faced not torture, but choice, not silence, but uncertainty. Yet in their choices, the essence of faith remained. Devotion, memory, and the search for God in a changing world. And perhaps this is the truest lesson, that faith does not end with survival, but must continually decide what it means to live. The story of Japan's first Christians does not end with triumph, nor does it end with defeat. It ends in shadows, crosses hidden in spoons and seed beads, prayers whispered in distorted syllables, memories carried like scars across generations. It is a story of faith that was never allowed to live in full daylight, yet never permitted itself to die. From the arrival of Francis Xavier on the shores of Kagoshima, to the grandeur of Nagasaki as the Rome of the East, to the blood-soaked hill of Nishizaka, to the silence of the Fumi and the torture chambers, Christianity in Japan lived a life of extremes. It was embraced by lords and peasants, crushed by shoguns, drowned in blood, preserved in lullabies. It was a faith, both political and personal, both weapon and refuge, both distorted and enduring. The martyrs sang as they died, and their hymns still echo. The apostates wept in silence, their tears as much a testament as the martyrs' blood. The peasants raised the cross as a banner of rebellion, then buried it beneath the soil of memory. The children learned the orosho as lullabies, never fully knowing their meaning, but knowing that the words carried something precious. Faith became inheritance. It became not only belief in God, but loyalty to ancestors who refused to forget. Every whispered prayer was a link in a chain stretching across centuries. Every distorted ritual was an act of defiance against forgetting. Even when doctrine faded, the weight of memory carried belief forward. When the dawn of the 19th century came, and the hidden Christians revealed themselves at Ora Church, it was as though the earth itself had spoken. We endured. They had no priests, no scriptures, no certainty, yet they had faith. They carried not the fullness of Rome's Christianity, but something perhaps more extraordinary, a faith sanctified not by cathedrals, but by survival. The world hailed it as a miracle, and indeed it was. Few religions in history have endured so long without teachers, sacraments, or written word. What the hidden Christians proved was that faith is not only a structure of doctrine, but also a memory, a whisper, a refusal to let the past be erased. Today, in Nagasaki, monuments stand where martyrs once fell. Churches rise where once only shadows whispered. The descendants of the hidden Christians still exist, some as Catholics, reunited with Rome, others as Kakure Kirishitan, preserving their unique traditions apart. Both are threads of the same tapestry, woven from centuries of silence and scars. And as one walks through Nagasaki's hills, where the sea wind carries both sorrow and song, it is possible to feel their presence, the fishermen, the mothers, the martyrs, the apostates. They are gone, yet not gone. Their memory lingers, like crosses carved into hidden places, like prayers murmured in the dark. What does it mean for a faith to survive? Is it survival of doctrine, of ritual, of authority? Or is it survival of hope, of memory, of devotion that refuses to die? Japan's first Christians remind us that faith is not always radiant in sunlight. Sometimes it survives in shadows. Sometimes it endures not as power, but as silence, not as triumph, but as scars. And yet, in those scars, something eternal speaks. The cross does not need daylight to endure. It can survive in whispers, in broken words, in the shadows of memory. And perhaps this is the greatest truth of all, that what is hidden is not lost, and what is silenced is not forgotten. The story of Japan's first Christians is not only a story of persecution and survival. It is a story of humanity itself, our longing for meaning, our capacity for endurance, and our refusal to let memory die.